But I was trying to think of a context for our discussion today. Because as Tom mentioned, I worked at the district level. I've been a coach, a teacher, assistant principal, assistant super, been all the way through the virtual side, consider myself a blended guy. But I've made a lot of mistakes too. I remember I got the training in 1996 when Clinton said we should all have access and devices. And then I raised other world-class solitaire players in my school, right? I taught them how to use the games, but we weren't changing teaching and learning at all. And then I had a SACS accreditation visit where they wrote us up for technology use because our computer labs were empty but clean. And they said we were really advancing technology, but no kids were on them. It just fell out in the report. So as you look at disrupting class, as you look at the world is open, as you look at Born Digital, and all these books that have trickled out in the past few years, they're all talking about, which goes first, the teaching or the technology, the pedagogy or the devices, and how do you make all of that work? Well, I'm here today to tell you that it's not an either-or discussion. It's a both-and discussion. When the teachers and when the commissioner talks about we're all having these horses lining up for the race, he's very serious because we need the experts not only at the P12 level, but the P20. And in North Carolina, our governor would say cradle to grave, right? We need everybody involved in this stuff. So I want to set some level sets with what you know in terms of analogies. When we've been doing these interviews and surveys, I've thought a lot about Rick Pitino and Tubby Smith. And those of you that are hardcore UK fans know that watching Pitino coach at Louisville is a little bit like your ex-girlfriend going to a party you're at, right? I mean, it's very difficult because you grew up on this. You had a passion. Face-to-face folks that were trained that way. I was trained that way. I was taught to lead in that environment. It is a paradigm. It is a pivot switch for us to think about digital learning all the time. And then along comes a couple years ago this guy named John Calipari. I think he's on some billboards around here, right? And what does he do? What's the first thing he does? Do you remember, technology-wise? He hops on Twitter, and he would go across the state, and he'd throw his arm around this person who was at a barbecue joint, and then he'd put the picture out on Twitter. And then he'd go over here, and he would comment about giveaways he was going to do. And then he hosted, I think, a dinner with Ashley Judd, right, for Haitian relief. And it got the most tweets within a given period that Twitter had at that time. Now, when we talk about that kind of change in this new era that we're in, everybody's doing this conversion except where it matters the most. See? Because if we fell asleep in a classroom in the 1950s and we woke up right now, we'd recognize a lot of it. So it's not an indictment on those that are trying to do it. It's not an effort that we're thinking about in terms of where we will be or where we're not. We're here to learn collectively today. So I want to take you a little bit through what we've done in Kentucky already. After the RFP was released in June, we got real aggressive around looking at reports. Because what better way for us to start than to look at what had already been done in Kentucky? The commissioner mentioned it this morning. There's a lot of great stories. There's a lot of pockets of innovation in this state. People doing fantastic things. And we don't want to create this add-on to technology. What we want to do is look at what's already present. So Bob quickly developed an e-learning community in Blackboard, and he pushed a lot of reports in there that we were also reading at the same time with national reports. Reports like Michael Horn and Karen Staker's report, Moving from Inputs to Outputs to Outcomes. Reports from the Fordham Institute, right, from CETA and others. And we were looking, using a methodology from Stanford called a SWOT analysis. We were looking at what were the strengths of all these reports, what were some obvious weaknesses, and how could we have some opportunities in Kentucky to really make a difference. When we finished the report scan, we then launched into some surveys. Now what we did is check for agreement based on Hancock's methodologies from strongly agreed, disagreed, and no preference, and we sent out a survey. Here's what's happened on that survey. 114 participants were identified. We sent 108 surveys, and we've had a really nice response as of last night. I checked it last night, and we're up to 55 responses. Those of you who do research for a living, we're already ahead of that 30% return rate, right? So we're seeing what people are putting back on the surveys and what they've challenged. And some of the comments on the surveys have been like, I hope this survey is not the only way we're going to discern what's happening with digital learning. And you couldn't be more correct. It's one of the approaches we're using. The other thing we started doing was talking about interviews in August. There were 35 stakeholders identified for the interviews. And we conducted a phone interview with them using Insight's protocols for 5 key questions around policy reform. And we let folks talk. And what happens when you let folks talk is they start saying things like, if you really want to get at this, you need to talk to this person. If you really want to learn about this, you need to go here. Or you need to see this research effort. Or you need to have this conversation with this person because 6 degrees of separation would change the whole game. Now, here's what we're seeing across the nation. We see a lot of good-intentioned people get to the table of this discussion. Dr. Holliday talks about these racehorses, right? That analogy. But the problem is 3 or 4 racehorses, not unlike what we see at Keeneland in October and other times of the year, really want to own this discussion, right? They want to roll out what digital learning means. They want to be the champ. But collectively, there's never been a pivotal moment to have multiple winners. We've got to have somebody to place, we've got to have somebody to show, and we've got to bring it home in collective races. Because the kids are depending on all of that. They're not depending on one champion at the university level, or the department level, or the district level. They're depending on everybody in the race. So when we go around the country and we talk about impediments to reform, right? There are things happening. You're going to see in our lifetime. I wrote a blog about this recently on Getting Smart, about educational malpractice insurance. I talked about we're going to see a time when a kid gets this opportunity in this district, and 5 miles in this other district, they can't get the same opportunity. That's going to be a property rights situation because access is going to be there for everybody. So let's talk about how we make that pivot and make that change today. Let's have some constructive feedback for all in the audience. So we went through these interviews. We're still going through them. You can see some of the terminal dates. Some folks could not get an interview scheduled or they were free this week. Our team is staying around today after the summit to conduct some of them. What we're going to do is move towards that target date of the 15th and 16th, make sure all the surveys have been completed or that everybody's had access. We're going to make sure all those interviews have been completed or that everybody's had an opportunity who wanted to speak to us. And we're going to cut that off around the 15th or 16th. So some of you are saying, well, I wasn't in the 35 or I'd like to be brought in that. Please reach out to us. We're trying to collect every data point we can. We've looked at the Bluegrass Institute's report. We've looked at what's happening at Kentucky Depot, at UK. We're thrilled that you guys have somehow wrangled Scott McLeod away from Iowa and others. We're really reaching out to multiple folks in this state and saying, tell us what the conditions are. When we talk about our summit focus groups for today, all right, we're using a modified force field analysis in 3 parts of the room. And we're going to give you an opportunity for break and conversation and network in a minute. And when you come back from break, we're going to set you up in force fields. Now, in a traditional force field, we're talking about what are the drivers in Kentucky. If you think about Tom's comments this morning, he was asking you the headlines. You know, the governor's task force report really got us all moving. That's where this thing got kicked off. And we started to think about, all right, what do we want to do with alternative pathways? What do we want to do with blended learning? And that's where some of the discussions began. So certainly that's a driver, but you're going to think of others. When we get in the group, we're going to talk about barriers, real barriers. Because as we've been talking to people on interviews, as we've been seeing survey comments, folks will throw up barriers. They'll throw up barriers of time, money, access, policy. So the only way you can truly address those barriers is to do what our last step of the focus group today is, come up with some concrete action steps to tackle. We've got to get to a point where those action steps are so clear and so concise for legislators in an elevator speech where you only have 45 seconds to make that speech, that it's very obvious what needs to happen for kids. So as we look around the country and we canvass great opportunities like requiring an online learning credit for graduation in multiple states, we look at states sunsetting education policy to try new protocol methods. You want one of the greatest threats to national security in the United States? The RFP and procurement process. Now we laugh, right? But I'm leaving a state where we got the race to the top money a year ago. We still haven't released the first RFP. That is a problem if we want to impact this generation of kids. So as we think about how to tackle some of those suggestions, be bold, be innovative today. Make some suggestions that we can capture, present to KDE, present to the commissioner, and we can roll forward to the General Assembly. Because that's really what we're after. Now, before we break, we talked a lot about shifting paradigms. And one of the great paradigm shifters of all time that I always quote before the break is Yogi Berra, right? If you folks want to do something you've never done before, you got to do something you've never done before, all right? So let's think outside of the box today. Let's push ourselves to make those suggestions. Be transparent, be open, because we're going to capture a lot of that work and we're going to listen to you. Today is not about sit and get. Today is about learning from what's happening in Kentucky. We think we've assembled a lot of great stakeholders to do that work. Now, before the break, I want to give you a few logistics. To my left, I will be running the blue group. And the blue group is listed here on your name tag. You have like a dot or a color. Tom will be running the green group at the back, and then Don will be running the red group to the back left. Now, those of you that got pre-assigned into colors, you don't know yet which areas you're tackling, right? But we've subdivided this down to the digital learning elements. We're going to have different elements discussed by different folks in force fields. If you didn't get assigned a color and you want to move a group, or if you find me incredibly boring in the first 3 minutes and want to wander over to the back, please do so. We want this to be an open space activity where you can participate